the idea for me was how do I stay in love with guitar making? How do I keep it as the best choice? And part of that has been, continued growth, and honestly, like a practice of curiosity about everything about the subject and the people who do it.
I'm very pleased to have Michael Bashkin as my guest this week on Life with Strings Attached. Residing in Fort Collins, Colorado, Michael Bashkin is a master guitar maker with over 25 years of experience making fine guitars, which are known for their craftsmanship, natural beauty, and decorative art nouveau and deco inlays. Before becoming a guitar maker, Bashkin studied and worked as a professional photographer in New York, then soil scientist for the U.S. Forest Service, and even spent 5 months hiking the Appalachian Trail. Bringing a unique perspective to his work, he emphasizes sustainable wood selection and a deep connection to nature. Beyond the workbench, Michael's a sought-after presenter, educator, and the host of his own show called Luthier on Luthier, a podcast for Fretboard Journal Magazine, which he dives into the world of guitar making with fellow craftsmen. I've very much enjoyed my conversation with Michael Bashkin. I hope that you do too.
Jamie, how are you?
Welcome to Life with Strings Attached. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Oh, thanks for having me. What a pleasure.
Yeah, I'm well, thank you. And how you?
Doing good. Little chilly this morning. It was coldest morning so far. We were at 16 degrees.
16 degrees. Yeah. Just to translate that, but I know it's cold. That's much lower than freezing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Chilly. So winter's coming.
Yes. My temperature skills are tragically Canadian in metric, so I have to remember 32 is your freezing point. Is that right? And then
that's correct.
Yeah.
And
right.
I shouldn't be complaining to a Canadian about the cold.
Well, this Canadian is currently in Tuscany, so.
All right.
Have at
there
it.
Goes my sympathy.
Yeah. So, well, great. Well, thank you so much for being on the show. I really appreciate it. And
of course,
I'm looking forward to our talk because I've interviewed a lot of interesting folks, and I've never interviewed another podcaster. So, yeah, that's exciting.
Well, yes, I rarely get interviewed, so it's nice to sit on this side of the mic.
After reading your bio and sort of diving a little deeper into your history, I think people should interview you more often.
All right. Well, we'll see how this one goes.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to diving into some of these things, and so even where to start, because it's quite a bit of a journey there. Let's sort of move backwards a little bit. So, of course, I know you as a luthier, as a guitar maker, who has a podcast in association with the Fretboard Journal. I know many people who listen to your podcast and tell me how much they love it, and so I know that it's well respected and that you have a good audience behind you. But it didn't start there. You've been a scientist, and you've worked in other countries in forestry and such. And so, if it's okay with you, can we just give I read your bio before we started this, but the Coles notes from you, just sort of the moments that if maybe they didn't happen, that you might not be the Michael Bashkin that stands before us today. Where did you come from? Are you from Colorado or?
No. I'm actually originally from New York City, and I grew up in the suburbs right around New York City, first in Brooklyn, and then moved to just across the Hudson River to New Jersey. I was about 6 miles from Manhattan, and you could see the skyline from certain parts of my town. So I grew up in a very urban environment. My dad was a high school teacher at Brooklyn Tech, and so he commuted every day and had quite a bit of family in the city. So this is tangible to some interesting points, but I always had this feeling growing up that the city wasn't for me. Like, I was just fascinated with looking through my grandmother had a lifetime subscription to National Geographic, and every time we'd go visit her, I would just pour through the National Geographics and look at these amazing pictures of, wildlife and adventure and mountains, and then I looked around me and I saw none of that. And so early on, I felt like I always had a little bit of wanderlust going on. And when I graduated high school, I did sort of the safe move, and I went to a nearby college, Rutgers University, and spent a year there, and pretty quickly became just bored and kind of apathetic. And I developed this sort of feverish passion for black and white photography, which I kind of inherited from my father. We had a dark room in the house, and he had all these photography books. And there's one book in particular, it was published by Time Life, called The Family of Man, that I just paged through incessantly growing up. And it was it was mostly in black and white, and there were all these, it was like the best photos that they had gathered over the last 50 years. And I didn't really grow up in a artistic or musical household per se, but somehow having these photography books, I feel, really kind of imprinted on me. And so I dropped out, and I just said, that's it. I want to be a professional photographer. And through kind of hook or crook, I was actually able to get a job working as a photography assistant in a commercial studio in New York City. So then I kind of took on my father's role, and I commuted into the city every day by bus. And I worked in a very kind of high-paced, somewhat high-pressure commercial studio. We did everything from 35 millimeter to 8x10. But it was all film back then. This is in the late 80s. And I spent a lot of time developing in the darkroom. And one of the things I noticed was that I really enjoyed working with my hands, and I liked sort of the technical aspects of photography as well as the artistic. And I said, this is my career. And I was about 19 at the time, and I was able to kind of take advantages of seeing some amazing concerts in New York City, including I got to see B.B. King many times, Miles Davis, Stevie Ray Vaughan, and so I had music was becoming a bigger part of my life. And then I was on a commercial shoot one day, and I was talking to this photographer, and he was just asking me, about kind of what my plans were. And he said this one thing to me, and honestly, I feel like it changed my life, where I was a very young kid. I was 19, and he's like, says, "Oh, are you going to go to college?" I was like, "No, I went to college for a year, and, it wasn't for me." And he literally stopped. And he looked at me. He's like, "You mean, you have the opportunity, like you have the wherewithal, the financial resources to go to college, and you're choosing not to go?" And somehow that hit me really hard. Like, wow, I really should really rethink this, and maybe I am passing up a great opportunity. And from that inflection point, I started to think about going back to school, and within, I think it was 4 months, I had not quite taken a 180. I stuck with the photography. I bought myself a large format camera, and I applied to colleges only out west, because now I wanted to get into the National Geographic discovery phase. So I went to the University of Montana, and I moved out there without knowing anybody. And that was kind of the start of a new life for me post high school. And once I got there, I sort of fell into a social group that was more into um, forestry and wildlife, and I noticed myself doing less photography. I went there as an art major, and I took some like photojournalism courses, art history, etc. But I really didn't like those, and what I liked doing was just hiking around, and it was amazing to me that I could go to class in the morning, and then in the afternoon, I was hiking in the Bitterroot Valley, and I could see moose and for a kid who grew up outside New York City, this was like going to Disneyland every day. It was just phenomenal. And I just began to develop a curiosity about, the trees and the rocks in my environment, and, why does this tree grow here and these species are here? What makes this good elk habitat, etc. So I switched my major. I became a forestry major, and that was, I had some amazing professors, and that was really the first time in my life where I was in a classroom and I was totally engaged in the subject, 100%, just enthralled by it. And it was just, kind of right time, right place. And I really feel very fortunate that I got to experience, to learn something from really good teachers that I was totally interested in, like hanging on every word and, studying. And so studying very hard.
How old were you by then?
I was like 20, 21.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I got a degree in forestry from the University of Montana. Had a great time. I worked during the summers. I stayed out west, and I worked for the U.S. Forest Service, everything from fighting fires to what they call silviculture crews. So we would go out and measure trees for everything for assessing timber sales to wildlife habitat. And my interest mainly was soils and everything from soil chemistry, basically their ecosystem function, etc. And then I got a job as a soils tech, and then to continue the wanderlust. And if I'm wandering too much here in the story, just stop me.
I love it. I love going deep. Let's go more.
Okay, so I was a very avid. I don't know. I just felt like an outdoors person. I was hiking incessantly. Camping, going on long treks, etc. That a friend of mine, we were both graduating at the same time. This was in 1991. We decided to try and hike the Continental Divide Trail from Mexico all the way to Canada. And it's become a little bit more, popular now and easier to do. But when we did it, we were doing, paper maps and compasses and there was no trail. There's much more of a trail nowadays. There's only sections of a trail when we did it. And the gear was very different. So after graduation, we found ourselves in, I think it was April 10th, 1991 at Palomas, New Mexico, which is right at the border south of Las Cruces, the middle of the desert. And myself and a couple friends, we started walking north, and we basically didn't stop for about 5 months. I had some other things coming up in my life in terms of job and personal relationship that, I decided I had enough once I crossed over into Montana, and the weather was really getting quite cold. And so some of the group kept going and some of the group split up, and, it was all kind of complicated and soap opera-ish. Sure. But I got offered a job at Duke University to be a research tech in their botany department. And so even though I swore I'd never move east of the Rockies, I went to North Carolina and I took a job at Duke, and we were basically working in an area called they call the phytotron, and we had these probably the world's most advanced growth rooms where we could control the atmosphere, light, nutrients, and we were basically studying. And again, this is in like 1991, 92 at this time. How tropical trees respond to elevated levels of CO2 under different nutrient and temperature regimes. And I really enjoyed that work, and a lot of it was very hands-on. I had to develop certain measurement equipment and do all the data harvesting and some of the analysis. I wasn't writing papers, but I did get on a junior author on several papers. And it was a great experience, but I was longing for the West again. And so I got offered a research fellowship at Colorado State University in the forestry school. And so I moved back out west to Fort Collins, Colorado, where I've been for the last 30 years. And I started in the master's program in forestry and had a great experience. Got to work in Hawaii, where I did my master's research on soil carbon cycling and eucalyptus plantations. I got to work in Alaska, Belize, all over the West. So it was great. But it was also at this time that I discovered Luthier, because I was also a guitar player, and I began just playing out at open mics, singer-songwriter kind of stuff. And I bought my first decent guitar, which was a Gibson J60, and I needed to have a pickup put in it, and I got a name from a local music store, and they said, yeah, let's give this guy a call. And I remember I went over to his house, and I walked into one of his, I think it was one of the bigger bedrooms, and there was workbenches along all the walls and guitars on all the walls and tools. And I'm not quite sure what exactly it was, but the moment that I walked into that room, it was like somebody pressed a button for me. And I was like, oh, well, this is it. Like everything else I've been doing has really been fun and cool, but this is the most interesting and exciting thing I've seen. And it just never really occurred to me, the idea of that people make guitars, they repair guitars, and it just seemed like this amazing intersection of music, which I was very passionate about, working with my hands, which I've mentioned several times, and there was certainly scientific and artistic aspects that really engaged me. So, this was pre-YouTube, still in the days of VHS tapes, and so I kind of went hard into it, gathering all the information I could. I got Dan Erlewine's Guitar Player Repair Guide. I bought his the couple of VHS tapes, which I still have. I can't watch them anymore, but they're kind of a nostalgic item for me. Sure. And I was very kind of proactive and persistent about it. There was a local music store called Osprey Guitars, owned by Charlie and Mary Gannon, and I owe them a lot because I basically just volunteered in their store. Charlie did repairs, and he basically let me watch him, ask questions, and I could restring guitars and clean them up. And then slowly I began to do repairs. And then I was still in my master's program at this point, and I had no tools, not a lot of money, pretty broke. And after I graduated, I kind of found all these jobs. So I found a full-time job in forestry as a soil scientist, but I was always doing guitars and guitar repair on the side. And I wanted to kind of transition more into guitars, and a serious inflection point for me was, I remember one morning I got up and I went to my office at the Forest Service, and I almost had a permanent job with the Forest Service. I had what's called a term position, and at the time these were really hard to get, kind of highly, coveted positions, because the Forest Service was really not hiring at the time, and it came with full benefits and retirement and all this stuff. And if you had told me a couple of years before, what's your dream job, I would have said, soil scientist in Colorado. And Jimmy, I had my dream job. And I went to my office one day and I turned on my computer, and the computers were, they were monochrome at that time. So I remember that green cursor flashing at me. And this kind of sounds like the Matrix, but anyway, it was flashing at me, and I just let out this big sigh, and it was like a life-changing sigh for me, because it was at that moment that I realized that, man, I have my dream job, or I got the job that I wanted. It was my dream job. But it's not my dream job anymore. My dream job is to be a luthier. And I said to myself that I don't want to be here as much as I want to be repairing and building guitars. And it wasn't just that. I also felt like I'm actually occupying somebody else's dream job. And I should leave, and I should let them have it, so I could keep pursuing my own thing. So I started to make the transition. I was able to find a part-time research job in the Natural Resource Ecology Laboratory at Colorado State University. And these don't exist anymore, because I had a part-time job with benefits. And in the U.S., to have health insurance through your employer is no small thing. And I was, getting married at the time. And so I had this great situation where I was working, 20 to 30 hours a week at doing ecology and soil work. And then I could spend the rest of the time doing guitar repair and, building up a shop. And I did that for, a couple years. And I also got to do some really fun things where I was invited to teach a course in tropical forest ecology and management down in Belize. And I did this for a couple years in a row. This was for a undergraduate study abroad program. And so I was also, I was doing guitars at this time, and it was really great for me to be able to, go see and stand in, next to mahogany and Spanish cedar and cocobolo, and in my spare time down there, I was always kind of wood hunting and going around to local sawmills, etc. But it gave me a firsthand experience about, where these materials really come from at a local level and how they're managed, etc. And the next big inflection point was when my wife told me, we should start a family. Like, I want to have kids. And, I wanted to make and repair guitars. And, the two aren't like totally compatible. I mean, they're compatible, but let's just say, it's not without its challenges. And I thought, maybe in about like 5 years after I get my business going. But we were already about 30 at that time. So despite my timeline of 5 years, we had kids immediately, pretty much. And it was at the inflection point was that I felt like if I don't go into Luthier full time now, before we start having a family, then I may never, because once I have the responsibility of raising a family and everything that comes with it, I didn't know if I would leave the more certain path and, of being a scientist. So I quit. I left the full-time job, the part-time job. I kind of burnt those bridges, and my wife is a self-employed massage therapist, and so she couldn't quite say, you need to keep the job so you can get the benefits. And I was like, well, but you're self-employed, so I want to be self-employed too. So that was kind of the big leap for me. And I've always been really interested in that point. It doesn't have to do with guitars necessarily, but at that point in anybody's life where they sort of, jump without a net, and there's a moment of faith and excitement and anxiety, all wrapped up in one. And so I opened up a repair shop. I was working out of my basement, and almost building, no guitars at this time, because everything I needed to do sort of needed to be self-supporting and generate some income. So, and repairs was really kind of how I learned the trade, how I bought tools, and the guitar making was always a goal, but it was a secondary goal. And it really was, the first, I'd say 15 years of my full-time career was mostly doing repairs and kind of building guitars when I could. And, but it was still good. I love guitar repair, anything about it that I get to work with my hands and musical instruments. But I really liked the creative challenge and the idea of building guitars. And, so, I would make anywhere from 2 to maybe, 5 guitars a year, 6 if I was really cooking. But slowly, my guitar business, the custom guitars were growing, and about maybe 6 years ago, I got to a point where I had so many guitars in my shop that I literally couldn't walk in here. And I felt like at that point I had to make a choice. I was getting spread too thin between trying to be a guitar builder and repairing. And at that point I said, all right, I'm gonna take another leap, and I'm gonna go into just making my own guitars full time. And thankfully so far so good. So
great. Okay, and then how long ago did you start your podcast?
Okay, I started the podcast, I think, in 2017. So,
that's while you were still doing repairs.
Oh yeah. I was just kind of,
all right.
Just kind of transitioning out of that. And I tried different permutations of, having people in my shop and doing repairs while I would do building, but never quite worked out. It's, I was still always looking over somebody's shoulder and, making sure things were done right. And, but I really felt like I would never achieve the level of building that I wanted unless that was my sole focus. So, so I started the podcast because I'm answering a question that I'm not sure you're asking, but I can continue. I started the podcast because I basically discovered podcasts as a medium, and I enjoyed it. I loved listening to, at that time we didn't call them podcasts, but things like This American Life, Prairie Home Companion, etc. And then once the whole podcasting thing started, I was listening to very heavily to this one podcast by Mark Maron called WTF, and he would
What does that stand for?
What the fuck?
Yes.
Excuse me, or what the blank. Sorry, what the beep.
You can swear on my podcast. It's not a problem.
All right.
And I drew that out of you on purpose. Thank you for complying.
Sure, you got it. And I hope it rolled off my tongue easily.
Seriously. Yeah.
But I found that I really enjoyed this interview style of podcast, and he would mostly interview other comedians, but a lot of actors and authors. And the tie-in was that these were all people who were, in an artistic, generally like an artistic interest.
Creatives of some sort.
Yeah, exactly. And I loved hearing their stories, and I loved hearing, and I found them inspirational. I found that I could learn from them. I found them that sometimes they gave me a sense of, encouragement, when I needed it, like hearing other people when they went through rough times in their career, how they came out of it, et cetera, and all the ups and downs. And I thought, wow, I wonder if there's anything that's kind of guitar making focused type of podcast. And I came across Jason Verlindy's Fretboard Journal podcast, and but I really didn't find anything that was like what I thought would be like, I want a podcast that's like a fly on the wall discussion between, two guitar builders. And so I just had this idea kind of rolling around in my mind for a while. And I decided that, I was, in a weird way, I felt like I was waiting for somebody to ask me or give me, permission and to do it. And I decided, well, I'm just going to do it. And so, at that time I knew a lot of people, and I called up Irvin Samaji, and who I knew, and asked him if he would be on my podcast, the first one. And I hadn't really told anybody about this yet. Because it really didn't exist. And I asked Irvin, and the first thing he said to me is, "What's a podcast?" Yeah. So, but we got through it, and I recorded a couple, and then I saw Jason at the NAMM show, and I just asked him. I said, "Hey, I've got this idea for a podcast. I've got a couple in the can, and I really love your feedback on it." And I was a little bit worried about asking him because I thought there was a lot of overlap with his Fretboard Journal podcast. And I thought maybe he wouldn't be like so excited about the idea of helping me. And it was the total opposite. He's like, well, that not only does it sound interesting, but I'm actually looking for new podcast content for the Fretboard Journal. And he goes, why don't you, send me what you have and we'll see. So I finished all the editing on the Samaji podcast and sent it to him, and screwed a couple of things up in terms of the audio technical side of it. And he got back to me and said, I think this would be a good fit for the Fretboard Journal. You could do your own like fundraising, and I won't pay you, but you won't pay me anything, and I'll do the hosting, and that was I think this February it'll be 8 years. I'm up to episode 96. I do it once a month, and I made some great friends and contacts through the podcast, and I've helped other builders actually sell instruments, which I think is great. I'm really excited when somebody who I've interviewed sends me a DM and says, "Hey, thanks. Person listened to the podcast and they called me up and ordered an instrument or bought one." And so, I never approached it as a marketing tool for my own guitars. Although I think it's there in kind of a circumstantial way.
Sure.
But I I feel like it's more of not only a documentation of the craft and the people who are in it, but hopefully it also increases the overall exposure to the idea of custom guitars, and makes the potential marketplace more comfortable and interested in it. So
yeah, great. Well, thank you so much for sharing your story and bringing me up to speed.
Sure,
I appreciate it. This podcast started a great deal with the fact that I've been having conversations and relationships with guitar makers for decades now, in their homes, at restaurants, at shows, wherever it happens to be. But I've never been very public about the conversations. It's pretty rare to see a selfie of me and someone else, at a restaurant or somewhere, or doing that. I just never felt comfortable doing that stuff. It's not that I never show up in pictures, but I'm just not a self-promoter in that kind of way. And so, but the point is, most of the people who I interview, I have a very familiar relationship with. And you and I have spent, 15 minutes in total talking before today, I think, maybe. We've had a couple of conversations,
Yes.
at the Fretboard Summit in Chicago. I think you and I spoke very briefly at the Gallup School's Northwood Seminar, I think it was last year also, is where we met the first time. Certainly been aware of you for a long time. We've both been in the industry for a long time, but we just haven't passed very much. And so often my podcast starts off with, "Hey, how you doing?" I name their wife, their children. We talk a little bit about
right.
all of that. And so I actually really enjoy the few times where I've had a chance to get to know someone in the podcast, like I'm doing right now, frankly, getting to know you. And it's nice that you send me your bio ahead of time and all that. Of course, we request that to ask about it. But, there's so much to people. There's so much to what brings them to those moments, and you've made a few comments, which are, if you have enough conversations with guitar makers, those phrases come up. In particular, the one where you said, "It just hadn't occurred to me that people make guitars." Like, I'm sure you've heard that over and over again as you talk to guitar makers also. There's this moment of realization where the light comes on, like, oh, guitars are made by people.
Yeah.
I could be,
yeah.
I'm a people. I could be that.
Sure.
I could be a guitar maker. And this seemingly unreasonable draw to guitar making, because it's not a very practical choice. It's not a reasonable choice. Your high school guidance counselor, it's not on the list. It's typically not on your parents' list.
Right.
It's often not on your spouse's list, to become the guitar maker. But it becomes, and I don't want to over romanticize it, but I don't know that it's possible not to romanticize it. There's this calling to it. Like you find out about it, you can't stop thinking about it. It's the thing you want to do beyond reason, possibly. You're sitting there at your dream job, your former dream job anyways. You're living the life that you had set yourself on the path towards this goal. You're there, you're at the finish line.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
I don't want it anymore. And that's a fascinating thing. There's Nari Oxma, she teaches at MIT, and I watched there's a wonderful little series called Abstract on Netflix. I don't know if you've ever seen anything. They did 2 seasons of it. Yeah. And she's one of the industrial designers, architects. She's Israeli, and she said there's a phrase in Hebrew, Israeli, that basically translated roughly says, "I give myself permission to change my mind at any point." Mm-hmm. Like I'm headed in this direction, but it's okay. I don't need to completely commit if a better option shows up and we go in that direction. It's a bit cringy in Western culture when we think about our marriages and relationships and such, but I don't think that's what it really means. I think it really means what you're talking about. So you set yourself out on a path. I don't think you don't sound like you're full of regret for the choices you made to arrive there. But once you get there, to say, you know what? This has been good, but I'm now going to go and do this?
Yeah, absolutely. I would add to that there's another notion, which is to fail quickly. If you're going to try things, it's great to try things, but try them, and if they fail, just move on. Don't spend your life failing at the same thing.
Yeah.
And I've kind of kept that in mind, and just to add a little bit to what you said, the idea about changing your mind and being a guitar maker. I mean, I will fully admit that it hasn't been a smooth and easy path for me in terms of the pragmatic side. There's definitely been ups and downs, and certainly a lot of financial pressures over the years. Getting 2 kids through braces and college, and so I have thought about alternatives from time to time, and so the idea for me was how do I stay in love with guitar making? How do I keep it as the best choice? And part of that has been, continued growth, and honestly, like a practice of curiosity about everything about the subject and the people who do it. And when I first started, I'm not quite sure why I had this notion, but I had this notion, and I almost didn't have any right to have it. But even when I was making my first guitar, I thought to myself, I'm always going to be making guitars, and each one is going to be better than the last one. And I felt like if I had those 2 principles, then a bit naively, everything else would fall into place, because that gives me the idea that I'm going to stick with it. I'm always going to be making guitars, but also that there's a constant progression. It's never okay.
And
I've
a
arrived.
direction. You're aiming higher. You have a direction.
Yeah,
you have a
absolutely.
Path. Yeah.
So always learning. I think the curiosity is a huge point to it for me, because in many ways it's almost in totality it's an unknowable subject, because it crosses so many disciplines, as I'm sure you're well aware and have thought much about. But it gets in everything from science to psychology. So there's always more to know, more to question, more to test, more to try, more to appreciate. So that's a great thing about it.
Cedar Creek Custom Case Shop is your premier fretted instrument custom case maker, and we invite you to create a musical instrument case unlike any other, one that's unique to you. Every Cedar Creek custom case is hand-built by highly skilled craftspeople using only select woods, Providence Forge hardware, and premium instrument-friendly materials. At Cedar Creek Custom Case Shop, we are dedicated to helping you design the case of your dreams. Find out more at cedarcreekcases.com. Yeah, in your bio, you talked a little bit about mechanics of wood, but didn't come up in your story a moment ago. Where did that enter? Where did mechanics? Was that part of your formal education, or was that part of your research as a luthier?
More, well, a bit of both. But I wasn't a wood technologist. I mean, I did have to take courses in wood technology and dendrology, and but it was really more on kind of the ecosystem sort of side of things. But in terms of actual applications, it was more once I became a guitar maker that I thought, I was more entering, the idea of kind of materials science and wood as a subject. And nothing was really, I would say, a lot of it for me is, already been studied and published. And so a lot of it was just learning what's out there in terms of application of wood as an acoustic material. So you're looking at things like density, Young's modulus, appreciating the fact that, the wood is an orthotropic material, meaning that, in each axis, it has different stiffnesses, and how to understand wood that way. And it was, really when I got introduced to the work of Trevor Gore and Giuliano Nicoletti that I began a little bit more formal testing of the materials that I use, and coming from a background of knowing how experiments are designed and knowing things about like sample sizes and variation in most natural things that you measure. I feel like I have some insights into the material, that I'm using, but it's an ongoing thing. But I do, I have a formal testing program now that I use on all my tops and brace woods, back and sides less so, but yeah, it's certainly an area of interest and curiosity for me.
Yeah. So I'm struck by, and pardon my ignorance, help me walk through this for a second. So your work within soil sampling and understanding in forestry and the growth of the forest as a overall organism that's interconnected and that they relate to each other and that they affect each other. I'm making assumptions here, so stop me if I'm wrong. That they affect each other. I've heard other people speak on these subjects. The mycelium that connects them, that one particular tree will warn another tree through signals. One tree has this role in the forest, and they grow side by side with this other tree, which they form a symbiotic relationship within. And I'm just thinking now about the efforts for replanting, and that often when we replant, that they're monocropping the replant. They're doing it for industrial purposes. And about, simply that not all spruce is the same. And that a spruce that's grown naturally within an environment along with the other types of organisms that it has a symbiotic relationship with might in the end be a very different spruce than one that's grown in a monocrop sort of scenario. That is me making some grand assumptions. Is there anything to that? Can you speak to that?
Yes, it's a big subject. I'm not sure I'm not sure that
simple people.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I could be concise about it, but in the both I'd say like popular literature books and things. There has been some spillover of this idea of this sort of big, happy, healthy, family of a forest, and it was popularized by the research of a Canadian professor. I think she's at the University of British Columbia. I'm not sure. And her notions are about like kind of community, and the big trees are like these mother trees and they help the little trees, and that the forest is this kind of interconnected network, and to some degree that is correct. There are the fungal hyphae that do have a symbiotic relationship with the trees, and they basically release acids into the soil, which dissolve some of the nutrients that get taken up. They increase, water uptake, etc. And there has been shown some sharing of nutrients between trees. But honestly, I know a lot of people in the scientific community who feel like that case has been overstated. It's made into an emotional story that people will like about this. Every tree is like helping each other. But there's also a model in the forest that talks about competition, and that
Yes.
there's a limited number of resources, and that trees
That's
compete.
The Darwinian theory, basically.
Yes.
And that, survival of the fittest. Yeah.
And that trees compete, and that big trees don't necessarily help little trees. They use the same resources. They will block sunlight from younger trees.
Yes.
And so I'm personally, with my background, I try and be sort of judiciously skeptical about anthropomorphizing, these types of stories. And
to be clear, I wasn't trying to go there. I know who you're talking about. As a matter of fact, as you're talking about it, I'm thinking, I heard her on a podcast, possibly People I Mostly Admire, part of the Freakonomics episode. And I remember driving past a statue of Jimi Hendrix somewhere north of Frankfurt, Germany, while listening to it. All these images going through my head as you're talking about it.
Okay.
But that's not really what I'm talking about. I do understand survival of the fittest. I do understand that trees are basically a race to the light. That trees in the middle of a forest kind of grow straight up. Trees that are in the middle of a field kind of grow all over the place. They're just bathing in the sunlight. I understand this. I really was talking more about the mechanics of, do you find a difference in a monocropped wood species as far as materiality is concerned versus one grown in, let's call a more natural environment?
Yeah. Okay. Well, this time I'll be very succinct about my answer. Yes.
Great.
So the problem with monocultures, as you said, they're generally grown for speed, for biomass, and they're more susceptible to disease and insects. And so I would say that local details matter. For example, I've had some wonderful plantation grown mahogany that was, from like World War II plantations. And I think it makes excellent wood. On the other hand, if you told me about plantation grown spruce, I probably, even without seeing it, I wouldn't be interested. The growth rates are probably just too fast. And it's going to be a lower density wood. It's probably going to have very wide growth rings. So I would be skeptical about that. And you can see it even when you go to your local hardware store and you look at, 2x4s. They don't make them like they used to. So,
right.
Yeah. So I think there is a problem, with fast grown monoculture trees. Yes.
Now, I don't tend to put things in category of good and bad unless I have an objective. And so when we say I wouldn't be interested in that, they have wider growth rings, there's a lot that's implied there. But when it comes to material, I mostly think that we are capable of shaping materials when we understand the material. And that has a lot more to do with our construction than it has to do with the material itself. Now, some things fall so far out on the edges that they're not, you're making your life far more complicated than you need to by trying to use those materials. I get that. Okay. Trying to make a guitar top out of feathers would be ridiculously complicated. But theoretically, I'd like to assume that it's possible with a lot of work.
Sure.
And so when we're talking about spruce and the growth rings and such, can you talk about that a little bit more in the mechanical sense rather than the good and bad sense?
Sure. So generally speaking, if you have a spruce tree with very wide growth rings, and let's use the case of a lower density spruce like Engelmann or European spruce, you're probably going to have pretty weak wood radially, and somewhat longitudinally. You are going to have to probably leave the top a lot thicker, just to get the strength or the strength to weight ratio that you would like to maintain. You're going to be off of that. And so, yes, you can absolutely use this material, but I don't think that, at least for me, that it's an optimum material. I think for building a guitar, yes, but as most of the people, probably everybody that you interview or will interview, they're trying to go from capture those last little percentages of efficiency. And those are hard-won gains. And to start with a material that is inferior for your purpose, or let's just say maybe not inferior, but not optimal for your purpose, then you're going to start having to making compromises in terms of how you construct the guitar to compensate for it. And so as understanding how to use materials with different properties, I think it's great. I think it shows a functional understanding of a guitar. Well, top A has a little bit more density, so I'm going to change my construction and designs, in doing these things to make up for that. And maybe because of the player or the intended, use of the guitar, that's actually something that I want. But if I'm just, say, building a spec guitar, I have a certain sound in mind that, I like to hear out of my guitar as a certain response. And so I'm, certainly going to try and use the best materials that I can, because in a way, that's kind of the one great variable about guitars that is both fascinating and irritating at the same time, because I think guitar design and function is at a point now where we have a history. We kind of know what works, maybe what some of the limits are, and basically how it functions. But the thing that varies from guitar to guitar to guitar is the underlying materials. And so I think a luthier, through experience and just general pursuit of this knowledge, is the real bread and butter, I think, are the most gains, is to understand the materials that they're working with, and that you're not always working with the same materials. If you went to a chemist and you talk to them about, I need this compound made for me that will do A, B, and C. Okay, yeah, no problem. And then you told them, but every time you make it, the atoms are going to be different, or hydrogen is going to have different properties each time you make a batch of this. He would immediately hang up on you or kick you out, or but it's not possible. But as guitar makers, that's what we're dealing with. Every single guitar, we're dealing with variation in materials, and so I think it's important to understand the variation and appreciate it for what it is. It's both interesting and it can be frustrating.
Yeah. So I mostly agree with what you're talking about, but let me take this in a slightly different direction. I think we used a worst case scenario there, and really what I'm driving at, that I hope to know from your storehouse of knowledge that I don't have,
okay,
is, let's assume that spruce is not being grown quickly for biomass. Rather, it's just a well-meaning environmental group who's got a bunch of people together who went out and got their fingers dirty, plugging little holes in the soil, popping in little seedlings, and they had a good supply of little spruce saplings, and they didn't bother to plant anything else. It's just spruce. They're not trying to harvest it again for 2x4s. Is there a notable benefit to that spruce growing in conjunction with the other things you typically see with the spruce? A mixture of some other cedars, some birch trees, or some poplars in there. Will you notice a difference in how that spruce tree grows in the material sense, grown in a community of biodiversity versus a mono what's the opposite of biodiversity? Bio-indiverse, a
Sure.
a monoculture. And so could you can tell me, I don't know if that's the answer.
Yeah.
But
well, I would say that, okay, I don't know for sure, but I would say that local details matter. So, what is the climate in that one stand of trees? What are the soils like? What kind of winds are they going to have? Are the trees that are growing next to the spruce, are they, big, little? Is it going to shade out the spruce? Or what are the genetics involved? Like that, these are all details that would ultimately matter. So I wouldn't say unequivocally that spruce grown in a monoculture would, just that fact alone, it would be inferior to say spruce grown in a mixed species stand. So maybe it could be. Yeah.
Okay. I'm currently in Tuscany. The cooking in Tuscany is simple, but it's remarkable. And they're all working with the same ingredients, let's say. They've all got some olive oil, some tomatoes, some flour, some water, and they make a remarkable amount of things out of those few ingredients with some variation in it. But what one person produces with tomatoes, olive oil, and flour is not the same as what someone else produces. And so I think we make grand assumptions about that. And honestly, I find it no different with guitars. I think that if you make a guitar that is Indian rosewood with a Sitka spruce top and a mahogany neck and a rosewood fretboard and bridge, that does not guarantee an outcome, by any means. If in the ideal circumstance, we would all describe some bell-like tones, a full bass range, less, little lower in the mid range on that guitar, some powerful trebles. We might say that we want to have, some clear piano-like bass tones, all the descriptors that we all talk about with these guitars. But I have played guitars built with those materials that have very little bass response. I have played some of those that sound dead with no sparkle on the top end. The materials themselves are not the only part of the equation. They are an important part of the equation. But I think to think of them as simply rosewood, spruce, and mahogany is no more helpful than thinking of it as tomatoes, olive oil, and flour. That there's a great deal to do with the mastery of the person and understanding how you're working those materials. And so not just the construction, there's a lot of things that are sort of left for granted in guitar making, and that's okay. There are standards that are established, and I get it. We repeat the standards. Someone else has done the work ahead of you, all of that. But I also think there's a lot of assumptions made within those things. And so I'm always looking to glean some new information and have some conversations with people where I might learn something new with that. And I don't know anyone else who knows something about trees as much as maybe you do. I'm always struck by how when I look at Luthier timber, I can identify almost everything when it's cut. When it's standing, I have no idea. Sure. I don't really know what a mahogany tree looks like or what a purple heart tree looks like. I have no idea what a purple heart tree looks like, or an ebony tree really on the outside. I only know when they're cut and dried as to what those things look like. And
definitely easier that way.
As opposed to me grasping around in the dark, do you think that your experience on that side of things has given you some level of advantage in understanding material, or do you think it's not really related when it comes to your luthier work?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. I think that it's given me some advantages, but it's more in that I was kind of introduced to a way of thinking, which is based on the scientific method. That's essentially what it is. And, over the centuries, the last couple of centuries, the scientific method and that way of thinking and, falsifiable hypothesis testing, etc., at least has taught me to, view things with, to be objective, to be aware of cognitive bias, which I think can be huge in guitars. Mm-hmm. I think it's, really taught me to take a step back. How do I know this? What are the variables? Mm-hmm. Am I looking at correlation, or am I looking at causation? So it's that type of approach or thinking that I bring to my craft that I think works for me. For me, I see it as an advantage because I felt like it's helped me. It's helped me out. For others, they may not. They're make beautiful guitars and come from a much more, say, instinctual, artistic background, and if it works for them, then I think that's wonderful. I did want to comment a little bit about what you're saying about the food analogy, and besides making me a bit hungry, I would add that you're absolutely right. We can all start with the same materials, but the other two 800-pound elephants in the room are the design and the execution of the instrument. Mm-hmm. And if you think about those three pillars, the design, execution, and materials, it's like a three-legged stool, and you take away one of the legs, it's going to fall over. And if you don't have all three, it's problematic. For example, you could have wonderful materials and perfect execution, and if you have a shitty design, it's going to be a terrible guitar. You could have good design and materials, but if you do a bad job executing it, the results are going to be terrible. So it's in those, it's the design and the execution that, are certainly just as important as the materials itself. And as you pointed out, with the food analogy, I think it's the design and the execution where we see the variety of instruments and the personality that comes with each guitar, and how it's a reflection of the experience of the maker. I've been talking with some clients recently, and they have some sizable guitar collections, and as is common with that, they're not collecting the same type of guitar, and they they want a Wenge, and they want European maple, and they want mahogany, and it, in their estimation, that the experience and the hand of the builder is paramount. It's not just that, as you said, rosewood will do this, etc. It's rosewood will do this in the hands of, put your favorite builder's name in there. So.
Yeah. So the So this has been a fascinating thing. So you talked about design, execution, and materials, right? So the design part of it is something that is one of the hardest parts. That is often the last part that someone comes to when they learn to make guitars. It's the part that's underestimated the most, is finding an identity and the design itself specifically. Now, I guess I am mixing identity and design, whereas they don't have to be. You can make a tried, proven design of someone else's guitar and repeat it, and bring something to the equation where you do it with masterful skill. You do it consistently. You do it in a way that perhaps outperforms someone else's version of that existing model. But if because I've spent my career with looking for unique world-class instruments, that's been just my specialty, right? So as we all find a way to stand out, we all find our own space. My space has been about the uniqueness of an instrument, a unique world-class instrument that's contributing something to the conversation of the guitar. And so there are many amazing guitar makers in the world that I've had very little to no interaction with at all, just because they don't occupy that unique space, and they're not contributing necessarily something to the conversation of the guitar that hasn't already been said, and they have a very legitimate career and they make wonderful instruments. But it's not where I am. So I probably overemphasize design because I'm tuned into it, because it's what I spend my time doing. But I do think that even if you make an instrument that looks much like a classic design, well, I think that you talked about Irvin Samaji. I think Irvin is a perfectly fine example, doing his laminated sides or his constructed sides or whatever you want to say about it. There was a point where in the regular guitar market, if we talked about laminated sides, that meant, you didn't have the money for solid wood. That meant cheap guitar.
Yeah, right.
That's not what it means when you're talking about the many, many guitar makers now that make constructed sides to increase stiffness. Some of them are making them so thick now that they don't need to add oh my God.
If I may.
Kerfing, lining. Thank you. Jesus.
You got it.
They're not adding a lining, a brain fart, sorry, to it at all, because there's enough surface there. I mean, the lining is only there to create gluing surface. Its intention is to create gluing surface, although people would debate and discuss what the mechanical function ends up being once you create that gluing surface. And this shows that we are shaping the function, the sound of the instrument with construction, not just materiality. And so if you're making an instrument exactly the same as is traditionally done, if you're building yourself a Martin, if you're building yourself a Torres, something of the sort, and you can shape your sound then by changing from one wood to the next and say, I will make this same construction, but I will use a cedar top versus a Sitka top or an Engelmann top. I will use a maple back and sides, or I will use a mahogany back and sides or a rosewood back and sides. And that's a very legitimate way of doing it. But because I'm an explorer naturally, that I love to see new things, and I love to explore new concepts, new possibilities, because I've always been more interested in where we can go than a historical reference of where we've been. I think that the mechanical functions of the construction of the guitar are vastly underestimated by most guitar makers and are underexplored, and that we make a lot of assumptions that if you want X, well, that means this wood. If you want Y, it means this wood. Whereas you can get into that direction without using that wood. You can do something, as far as the design is concerned, and mechanically to, whether we're talking about, the aperture of the sound hole or the length of the soundboard, which we almost never mess with. The length of the soundboard makes a substantial difference in what's happening. And it's basically locked into place currently. There's a lot of things we can be doing, but most people just go to the wood library, and that's where their variation ends. And that probably sounds dismissive, and I don't mean it to be. I just
sounds like a challenge.
Yeah, well, it is, and that's one of my favorite things that I do in my role in our industry is I love giving people opportunities to do something they haven't done before, and to rise up and to try something new and to go to places they haven't done before, because it's very gratifying for them and for me, especially when you see it succeed. You know, and so I want to explore new territories, and I'm often ready to. People ask what my favorite guitar is, and the answer is probably the next one. It doesn't mean I don't like the old ones, but I'm just most excited about the one I haven't yet to see. And I feel the same way about food, by the way. I go to restaurants. Today I had lunch down the road here, and I told the waitress, bring me whatever you think will bring me back. You decide. I agree to pay, and I'll eat it.
What'd you have?
strangely enough, she called it a Mexican soup. She brought me a chili con carne in an Italian seafood restaurant, but she was very proud of it. And it was an unusual thing in the context of an Italian seafood restaurant. It was good. Nice. I just wasn't expecting to have chili for lunch today.
All right.
But often I have something that I wouldn't think to order, especially as you're traveling. I don't know the culture. I don't know what's on the menu. You can order the same thing over and over again, but I was in the town square in Florence, outside of the Uffizi Museum, surrounded by all of the Michelangelo sculptures, last week. And I was at a very tourist restaurant. I mean, I'm in the town square. I know I'm not going to get great food here, but I just want to sit and I want to stare at the sculptures and the fountain while I'm having my dinner. And I had probably the worst food I've had in the last 2 months that I've been here.
Yeah. Okay.
However, there were some people behind me from another country who sat down and I listened to them place their order, and they were behind me. I couldn't see them. And one ordered, Jack Daniels with club soda. And someone else ordered another non-Italian drink. And then they ordered a pizza. And I listened to the whole order going, you're ordering all the wrong stuff in Tuscany. It's not that we don't eat pizza here, but I mean, why don't you get an Italian wine or if you want a cocktail, order, a Negroni or a vermouth or something that's Italian, and they just travel around the world ordering the same stuff at a different bar,
Yeah, right.
And that's surprising to me. I like to explore, but that could be a fault of mine.
Well, if it is a fault, I have the same fault. I was just in Italy recently as well, and
yes,
after we were at the show in Cremona, my wife and I traveled around a bit, and we went to Florence and the Uffizi, and I had the same kind of similar food experience.
Yes,
I'm since I don't live part-time in Italy like yourself, for me, I felt the stakes were very high, and it became very emotional in terms of if when I had a bad meal in Italy, it really pissed me off because I only had so many meals to go. There was the limited quantity, and but it was my fault. We were in some very touristy areas, and etc. But yes, in a local area, I want to eat and experience what the locals are doing, because that's what makes the place special. How that relates to guitars, I'm not so sure. Other than that, I think that there's a strong bias towards tradition in at least a big part of the guitar market, even in the handmade market. People kind of, there's a certain comfort and familiarity. And from the Luthier's perspective, there's a pragmatic side, which is that, I build guitars for people to buy. And so, at least in my, business model, I'm kind of following the market. In other words, fulfilling a demand for what they want. Now I do build spec guitars where I can experiment and try new things. And there are other guitar builders like Michi, Andre Thierry, who, seem to just be out in the universe exploring. And I love to see those things. And I think it really, works for them. I'm not quite so sure, as a business model for me that I could make it in that vein.
I don't mean that you have to be so exploratory quite there. I actually mean that there's very simple things that I don't quite understand that affect the guitar that I don't hear enough people talking about. And that can be, the entire guitar is a system. It's a system of components, and there's a related effect that when you reduce or increase this element, it has an effect somewhere else, right, within the system. And that, we all cut a 4-inch sound hole, but actually that aperture makes a substantial difference. You can really tune the resonant frequencies of guitar with that aperture substantially. And also the amount of attack and the amount of sustain that happens with the instrument by opening and closing that sound hole. But yet we just cut it to 4 inches because that's what the jig is set up for.
Yeah, no, I disagree. The majority of the guitars do, but certainly my guitars, I vary the sound hole aperture, certainly on every model and to some degree on every guitar. And I know a lot of other people who do that. So I think
they're tuning or they're changing it by model?
Both.
Okay.
But the reason that I'm changing it by model is because I know that I'm going to want to tune it in a certain direction.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
And actually even on my larger guitars, none of my sound holes are 4 inches. So I want to agree with you that,
no, that's great.
I think that there are certain things on guitars that, we're just because of tradition, we're kind of, maybe as builders, we're sort of stuck in the mud. But I think those, the mud is becoming looser, and people are starting to break out of that. At least from what I see and the people that I know. And some of the changes are subtle or interior, where you wouldn't. I'd say my guitars have probably changed more on the inside than they have on the outside in the last 5 or 10 years. So these are changes that I know about, but wouldn't be to the casual observer. They wouldn't be known, but hopefully they could be heard and felt.
Certainly, and I certainly don't mean to say that the guitar is not evolving or changing by any means. There's many things that we could talk about that are very normal, that are within memory of their sort of being brought to marketplace. And you can see the acceptance curve. You can see how things like armrests and rib rests, are side sound ports, these things, bolt-on necks versus a mortise and tenon and a dovetail, all of these things were very controversial not so long ago, and now they're not so much, they've made their way sort of up into the marketplace and have been more accepted. And I don't mean to say that people are stuck in the mud. What I'm talking about is competencies and capacities and conversations. So just because you have a tool, just because you can do something, doesn't mean you should. And I teach a number of guitar making schools around the world every year. And I talk with a lot of guitar makers, as do you. And when we talk about the things that are important, or when I talk to the guitar makers who are measuring scientifically the wood, how it functions, we're not talking about the neck. We're not talking about the fretboard and its effect. It's everything is about the top. And I don't mean that the top is not very important. Of course it is. But the other parts of the system are also an important part of the equation. And I would like to see just more general exploration of knowledge. I don't mean that we need to all join the freak show. And I mean freak show quite endearingly. I've been part of the freak show for a very long time in the guitar market, and I don't think that everyone needs to be there. I would just like to say let's broaden the conversation. Let's be a little more curious and understanding, and asking the right questions. That's super important, and when you're talking about the scientific method, I mean, that's a big part of it. What questions did we ask? What questions are we asking the right questions? Yeah. Can we ask a question that gets a different result?
I think, well, I mean, I agree with you. I know it doesn't make as much for interesting conversation and some back and forth, but I think especially the part about asking questions, one of my biggest concerns, more so than not getting an answer, is, am I asking the wrong question? And you bring up a good point about the measurements and the things that we as guitar makers kind of latch on to. And there's this idea, it was especially popular in ecology because it's a hard thing to study, that we measure certain things because we can, because the things that we really want to measure, we can't. And I would say, when I think about these things, that's something you really have to be careful of. And ultimately, like, if I could pick one thing to measure about my guitars, it's happiness. Like when I hand a guitar to a customer, like really what I want to measure is their happiness. To me, that's the ultimate summation of everything that I've put into it and how they're experiencing the guitar and what they're bringing to it, etc. And it's a nice thing to think about. It's a ridiculous thing to measure, but that's where ultimately, that's what I would like to measure. I'm not going to try and develop a methodology for it. Maybe you could by surveys, etc. But, you get feedback from your customers, but it'd be nice to just plunk down a meter. It could look something like a Peterson tuner. And then, all right, you've got a 9.5 out of 10. Good deal. So
I think we call it a survey and a lie detector, actually.
Yeah. Okay. Sure. Well,
yeah.
Maybe
we could put a forest of your guitars together and bring in that forestry scientist from BC, and she'll tell you the happiness of your forest. But
all right.
Completely facetious. I'm sorry if that was out of line, but
that's okay. That's okay. But
I think it's a wonderful measurement. It's a wonderful thing to talk about, because there is such high personal investment in being a luthier, in being a guitar maker, and there is this constant struggle with validity. There's this validation that's needed. There's this awkwardness of going to a guitar show. I recently interviewed Rosie Haydenrick from Turnstone Guitars in the UK, and Rosie was like, you have to be able to stand there beside your guitar and have someone judging it in front of you. And and you need to be able to stand beside your work and say, yeah, I did that, and I'm proud of that, and what that is. But I mean, that's a big test on your psychology and your personal happiness, the client's happiness. We all negotiate our relationships with our community around us, and there is a common theme that is being discussed lately with my guests, has been the truth that is found within the made object. So no one's seen it yet, but the person who I interviewed right before you today is a special effects person. He's worked on everything. He's worked on all the Hobbits. He worked on Deadpool, Wolverine, all sorts of amazing films. And we talked about this digital sort of thing versus the physical. There's no Command Z. There's no undo function on your miter joint.
Sure.
Right? There's a truth to wood and glue. And I interviewed recently Peter Korn also, who started a very important studio furniture school, perhaps the most important studio furniture school in the world, out in Maine. And there was, again, there's just a truth to building something with your hands that's undeniable, that living in our virtual world, that we're almost missing. We need a little more objective failure. We need a little more of, I didn't do that right. You can see it right there. That didn't, that seemed separated, I didn't glue that right, or whatever it happened to be. Right. I remember the first time, I don't talk a lot about making guitars, but I remember the first time I went ahead and, tried to level my binding and realized I didn't level my sides well enough because my binding is going thicker, thinner. There's no denying it. It's right there.
Sure.
And you made that mistake a few steps back. You didn't make the mistake right then. And there is, there's a truth about building something that I think is really important. And so this idea of that you talked about three pillars sort of within guitar making, but within our humanity, we sort of live in our head, in our heart, and our hands. The philosophical, the emotional, and then the actual doing. That's sort of a Steinerism from Rudolf Steiner that we talk about often here on Life with Strings Attached. And that part of actually doing something and then standing beside it, and not only you judging yourself, but having someone else judge it. And then hopefully the objective is, do they like it? Are they happy? They paid a lot of money for this. They've been waiting a long time for this. They've been dreaming about this. Did we fulfill the dream? Did we hit the mark? Did we exceed the mark? Does it fall short of the mark? That can be super stressful for many people.
Yeah. It's interesting. I was talking to another guitar maker recently, Megan Wells, wonderful archtop guitar maker. And she has this part of her practice is that when she finishes a guitar, it's kind of built into the price that she hand delivers it.
Yeah.
And, literally gets on a plane, flies there. And I do something different. I actually, when I finish a guitar for a client, I don't really intentionally talk about it that much, because I don't want to bias them. I don't want to give them a preconceived notion of, oh, I think this guitar has great bass, or whatever. It's kind of like I want them to experience it for the first time for themselves, without me there, because I think that would affect their experience. And anything I might say to them about the guitar, I think that can affect their experience as well. That's just my idea and approach about it. I do, of course, I do say I'm happy with the guitar. I hope you are as well, because I kind of want to hear what they think about it, and so that's kind of some of my thoughts about it. You said a lot, and I agree with it. I think there's, the guitar, there's the physical object, and then there's this psychoacoustic aspect, which, we interpret the guitar through our senses, and it's going to be different for everybody. How much coffee did you have that morning? How you feeling that day, etc. And those are real, and I don't discount them at all. How a person experience it it's a complex set of interactions, just like the guitar itself. And underlying all that, everything that you said previously and I've just said, you can almost put that divided by time. All of this is going to change over time. The instruments are going to change. The person playing the guitar is going to change. And so we have to contend with that as well. So, and the last thing I'd like to comment on, and I'd like to hear a little bit more about this from your side, is that when you talk about the made object and the reality of a handmade object, there were some notions years ago about that the acoustic guitar, specifically the acoustic guitar, is going to, sales are going to decline. The market's getting smaller because now people are treating, two turntables and a keypad as, or a laptop as a musical instrument, which is true. And I think it's great. But the acoustic instruments, I won't include the piano, but they've shown to be very resilient, and I think even increase in their sales. And I want to know what you might have what you think about this. But do you think it's because of that kind of in an increasingly digital world? We have this object that gets made by one's hands and then placed in another person's hands to use and appreciate. And it's that connection that makes the acoustic guitar enduring in the marketplace.
Yeah. So as the world becomes easier and as the world becomes more virtual and somewhat less relatable, we look to ground ourselves, and we look for things to connect us to nature. So ecotourism is way up. One of my best friends is very, very deep and high up in the travel industry. And he flies around the world speaking. He probably spoke at 2 conferences this week in the travel industry. Ecotourism and experiences are way, way up right now. Even though people are on their devices all the time, they're actually looking to get off them. I listened to a podcast yesterday, a finance guy and in AI was talking a great deal about things, but he just came off of a trip where they went away into the middle of nowhere with Toyota Land Cruisers and slept on tents on top of these vehicles in the desert for 7 days with no cell phones, and how amazing it was, and how how you immerse yourself in that natural world. And I think that we're seeking that. There's young people are going to bars and playing bingo. They're playing bingo and board games. There's recently in the news it came up that there's a cafe in Amsterdam that specifically advertises, we are a no cell phone, no computer cafe, and it's packed with young people going there to unplug. And so I think that the acoustic guitar benefits from that, but also I think that there's the speed of growth and the speed of evolution within the acoustic guitar is slow enough in this modern world that we don't recognize the change. And the modern acoustic guitar, this is not your daddy's guitar. This is not your grandfather's guitar. The modern, what many people call the modern fingerstyle acoustic guitar at this point in time is a hybrid between a Stratocaster and a Martin at this stage. It has a faster response. It's more stringy. There's more top end. There's more fidelity to it. There's a richer bottom end. It's just a much broader spectrum in general. Historically, we develop music and we repeat music. We reenact the music that we hear that's in our songbook. And that songbook was recorded in ways where our technology really filtered the sound of that guitar. And then the way we listened to it back on our stereo systems really filtered the way we heard. So the quality of sound that we were able to capture and reproduce in your lifetime when you were 10 years old versus now is very different, right? So we all know the fidelity. We remember going to movie theater and seeing THX sound come on the screen and this big bass drop and this really big digital highs. We couldn't do that before. And so that is represented in the acoustic guitar, both in recording that builds out the songbook and then changes our expectations as to what we want in that guitar. And so it is evolving. It's not the same guitar. And so perhaps what was, if it had changed, if it didn't change, if it didn't evolve, if it didn't offer new possibilities, I'm not sure we'd be seeing the same staying power. But it's because the guitar is the people's instrument and it changes with the people, unlike any other musical instrument in the world. I think that's the guitar's true superpower, is it how it constantly evolves with the people.
Yeah. Thanks for that.
Too much?
No, that was great. I certainly I've never thought about it like that before. And I appreciate your insights to that. I mean, you think more about the overall market. You see more of the overall market certainly than I do. I think a lot of builders, including myself, we can't see the forest for the trees, and you have a view of the forest. Yeah. So it's I think the future is bright for guitar, and I think the future is bright for organic and tactile things. I mean, just look at what's happening here. What you see behind me is a 15th century wall and an old wardrobe. Mm-hmm. What you're seeing it through is an incredibly advanced iPhone Pro, a laptop, and a very portable recording studio that couldn't have existed only a few years ago, right? And so you're seeing the two worlds meet. You're seeing me engaging in the old world through the eye of the new world.
And I think that both things will continue to be a part of humanity, that we will both seek a refining future, but also that we'll continue to conserve and maintain what is important to us from our past and our history.
Yeah.
So
I'm excited. There's reasons for me personally to be excited about the digital world. I certainly use it in my shop. I have a CNC machine that I use. I certainly, like you pointed out, initially when I started the podcast, I was committed to only doing in-person interviews. But then when the pandemic hit, I quickly switched to remote interviews, and it made it all possible. And it's something that I'm really glad has happened, and I'm glad that both worlds exist. So on the digital side, there are some downsides. I think, at least for me personally, certain aspects of social media and marketing, it comes with some anxiety. And it's nice to put the phone down once in a while where, why am I spending so much time on this? There are other things. So
the real commodity everyone is attention. That's the real commodity of the modern world, is attention. And so, let's, Michael, I really appreciate you being on the show today. I've had a lovely conversation with you. It's been nice getting to know you. I always like to throw it back to the guest. Is there something that you were hoping that we would have discussed today that, had I been a better interviewer, I might have asked you?
Oh, well, that's a good question. The only thing that comes to mind is, if we could look into our crystal balls, like one of the things I'm curious about in terms of the development of and the evolution of acoustic guitars goes back to the materials, and that what we can do to actually modify those materials. And some of this certainly already exists in terms of thermally modified wood, which we see more and more in guitars. The use of some synthetics. We have some, carbon fiber guitars, etc. And I certainly think they have their place. And some of them I think are really getting quite good. So I'm kind of interested and excited to see what happens from a materials perspective about how we can, take, say, a piece of wood and modify it. And I'm not just talking thermally, but maybe even adding like a 3D printed carbon layer, into it. And so I think there's a lot of interesting things that could be done in the future with the materials that we use. And I'm curious to know kind of, your thoughts on that. And that's just something that I wanted to express, something that, if I, say, didn't have to make a living and be selling guitars, this might just become a research lab for guitar making. And one of the things that I would certainly focus on is using the power of technology to try and optimize materials.
I think we're really close to that because of where we are with technology, for a couple of things. One is that the way that we currently produce guitars is a reductive method. And what is really changing the way that we view manufacturing is additive manufacturing. So let's call it 3D printing for lack of a better term at this point in time. But effectively, it's a CNC machine that is adding material as opposed to taking away material. And that's why I think it's so important to understand structure and materiality, as opposed to just switch out this material for this other material built in this same way. So, when we change material, we may have to change our approach. You'll only get so much result by using the exact same structure that evolved around a particular set of materials. If we were using a different material, we might have evolved a different structure. There's form follows production, and a great deal of what we did and what we do on guitar has a lot to do with solutions that came up because of our limited capacity to clamp something down, cut it, glue it, whatever it happened to be, for the time that it was developed. The Spanish guitar was built on the Solera, right? And when they started putting dovetail joints, which we now consider to be, the traditional way, well, a dovetail joint was a furniture joint, not an instrument joint. And that was part of what came in with mass production of guitars was dovetail joints. That wasn't a traditional method at all. And then on the bolt-on neck and so on and so forth. And we continue to evolve with our capacities. But all of the efforts and scientific development in manufacturing are actually in additive, not reductive methods. And so I think that's going to be really interesting. And so if we're choosing to build up the material in the first place, what structure would we build up with it?
Yes, that's the question, because I've been kind of following the 3D printing technology since it started. Just out of interest. I don't have a 3D printer yet, but I hope to have one at some point. But when it first started, I was like, oh, that's cute. You could print a little pencil holder and, maybe some Christmas ornaments and things like that. And then it's like, oh, I didn't realize that you could actually 3D print steel, metal. And at first metal has to be forged, but you can actually 3D print it now. And then I learned that you can 3D print biological materials, organs. And I thought, well, if you can 3D print an organ, you could probably 3D print a wood-like substance that has exactly the properties you want, with stiffness and the axes you want. And I wish I was a little younger, because that's an idea that I've had that I think is worthy of future exploration, and maybe somebody will do it. Maybe I'll be involved. I don't know.
Oh, well, I would encourage you to take whatever step you can in that direction. Because why not?
All right.
Let's continue to be curious. So
yes, let's continue to be curious. That's a beautiful thing right there.
Yeah. So, Michael, thank you so much. I hope this is not our last conversation, just one of our first. And thank you so much for being on Life with Strings Attached. We do have another segment we do called The Business of Guitar, and we'll give let's say 3 to 5 minutes on business of guitar before we wrap this up for today. For those of you who are interested in the guitar business itself, we put this one on our business of guitar on Patreon. So you have to go over to patreon.com/business of guitar. That's patreon.com/business of guitar if you want to hear Michael's insights in moving from scientist and forestry through to guitar repair and guitar making. Thank you so much for being on Life with Strings Attached, Michael. It's been great having you here.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you, Jamie.
You're welcome. Thank you for watching and listening. You can find more episodes wherever you listen to your podcasts, and a special thanks to those who support us on Patreon. It's your support that enables us to do this work.